Hello, role-playing people, and in this episode we're going to have a look at the lore of the spirit, the Slayer's ability to speak with, summon, or command the souls of the dead, binding them to a physical anchor and even reuniting the spirit with its body, bringing it back to life. Unlike the previously discussed lore of death, this one is much less confusing lore-wise. It was developed after the fall, after mankind lost its immortality, out of the Slayer's desperate desire to prevent the souls of their beloved mortals from simply disappearing out of known creation, facing a fate completely unknown to anyone. Whether they were returned to the Wheel of Death and Rebirth, as the Chakravanti mages came to know it, or transcended creation completely, entering the elusive second world, these souls could no longer be found after they were separated from their bodily anchor. So the Slayers, in their desperation to aid humanity, or to prevent the Loyalists from stealing these spirits, found a way to alter the very mechanisms they had previously created. At first, they anchored these souls to physical things, but when that showed to be quite ineffective against the depredations of the Loyalists, a Duke of the Alabaster Legion, named Charon, decided to create a safe haven, hidden beneath even the lowest and deepest layers of the Kazdeja Bastion. But that is a story for the lore of the realms. For now, let's read some evocations. Speak with the dead. This evocation allows the Slayer to communicate with spirits roaming the physical or spirit world. Spirits addressed in this way are compelled to respond, and they must answer the demon's questions to the best of their ability. System: role manipulation plus awareness. The spirit can attempt to avoid the evocation's compulsion with a resisted willpower roll difficulty 9. If the evocation is successful, the spirit must answer the Slayer's questions truthfully. The Slayer can affect any spirit within reach of her voice, and the effects of the evocation persist for a number of turns equal to the character's faith score. Torment. Monstrous demons can perform this evocation as well, but the spirits they contact become warped by the demon's torment and grow inimical to living beings for days afterward. Spirits affected by this evocation become restless and hostile to the living for a number of days equal to the demon's torment score if a willpower roll difficulty 9 fails. Okay, so immediately what needs to be said is that some passages are ambiguously phrased yet again. For instance, when the book says, allows the Slayer to communicate with spirits roaming the physical or the spirit world, or the Slayer can affect any spirit. This applies only to the spirits of the dead, or wraiths. By physical world, the book refers to wraiths who are in the Shadowlands, just beyond the shroud separating them from the plane of the living. When it says spirit world, it is referring to the deeper, low Umbra, the actual underworld where the Tempest separates the inhabited isles that are the Dark Kingdoms and their various necropoli from one another. Mechanically, the power works very well, and it can be a valuable source of information if the storyteller so wishes, because the answer, though always truthful, will depend on the wraith's own ability and knowledge, thus it will depend entirely on the storyteller. What I find most interesting is that the ability doesn't say the Slayer can also see the spirits of the dead. Rather, they can only hear them, at least when interacting with wraiths who are in the Shadowlands. This adds so much to the element of mystery and to the immersion itself, I think, since it encourages the player to interact with a potential wraith in pretty much the same way you'd interact using a Ouija board. And questions like, what's your name? How long have you been here? Do you know what you are? Are you in danger? Are bound to come up. At this level of perception, the Slayer has no idea who is on the other end of the line, shall we say. To make use of Wraith the Oblivion lore really quick, it might be a drone who's not going to reveal any interesting information, or it might be a guild wraith, a harbinger, a masker. Maybe it's a specter who's made its way to the Shadowlands for some reason. But if the storyteller doesn't know their Wraith the Oblivion lore, that's no problem at all. The events of Demon the Fallen occur after the 6th Great Maelstrom in 1999, which is pretty much the event that ends the setting of Wraith. It is the low Umbra apocalypse. Storytellers can get creative with what the low Umbra is at this point in time after the 6th Maelstrom. You can go heavy into Wraith lore, you can just use the description of the underworld found in the Storyteller's Companion, or rework the geography and the nature of the low Umbra altogether, if that suits your chronicle better. Storyteller's choice. Next dot. Summon the dead. Slayers can use this evocation to summon spirits to their presence, their influence reaching across entire city blocks. Spirits summoned in this fashion must come to the demon whether they wish to or not, and they remain until dismissed. System. Role manipulation plus leadership. The Slayer can summon one spirit per success rolled if any are present in the area. The evocation affects 10 square yards times the character's faith score, and spirits within the affected area are drawn to the Slayer's presence immediately. They remain until the effects of the evocation expire or the demon dismisses them. The effects of this evocation last for the duration of the scene. At the storyteller's discretion, a particularly potent or willful spirit could try to break the demon's control with a resisted willpower roll, difficulty equal to the demon's faith score, made against your manipulation plus leadership successes. Torment. Monstrous demons can summon spirits, but the effects of their torment cause the beings to become inherently hostile to the living for a number of days equal to the character's torment score if a willpower roll, difficulty 9, is failed. I like what this evocation is trying to do, but I think having an area of effect on it is not only unnecessary, but setting breaking, and it encourages ability spamming. At the starting faith of 3, the character can only summon ghosts who are present within 30 square yards or 25 square meters, which is half of a small apartment. It's basically the size of a studio. Though the description of the evocation says your character's influence reaches across entire city blocks. So again, we are in that situation where the description doesn't match the rules. While I normally enjoy the fact that the difficulty is static, a solid 6, disregarding the strength of the local shroud is not a good thing in this case. I mean, rules as written, I summon one spirit per success rolled at the standard difficulty, and it's the same difficulty whether I'm in a crypt or in a mall? That doesn't sound right. I shouldn't be able to just reach beyond the shroud effortlessly in heavily populated, banal areas. Not to mention, what, if there's a wraith just beyond the 5-meter line, will it look at all the other wraiths being summoned and say, nope, I'm out of range, so I don't care? That's very silly. Given that the number of successes rolled determines the number of spirits being summoned, the area affected isn't actually relevant, and I don't think the area should be precisely quantified, or if it absolutely has to be quantified, it should be considerably larger, because otherwise it means that there can be, on average, 2 spirits per 30 square meters, and that is just game breaking and setting breaking. It means you can't even go to the bathroom without a ghost watching you from beyond the shroud, because ghosts are absolutely everywhere. It doesn't make sense. If, despite the player's successful roll, the storyteller says, no, there are no wraiths here, some players will just say their character moves 5 meters in whatever direction and try the ability again until something gives. And that feels like the player is trying to cheat the system and the rules, but ultimately it's not their fault because they were just trying to create an interesting scene. So certainly the storyteller can say no. There are no wraiths here, but then the player can't even rely on a successful use of this evocation. When they use this ability successfully, you should reward that success. That's the whole point of superpowers, really, to create an interesting, and I would dare say, reliable, special interaction between protagonist and world. So again, I love the idea, and the power works pretty well. I also like the High Torment version, but I definitely think the range shouldn't matter too much, or it should be larger, depending less on faith and more on the scene itself. If a protagonist is in a graveyard, for instance, then they summon whichever spirit responds within that entire space. If they're in an apartment, they might summon one or more ghosts within that block of flats, or maybe even from adjacent buildings from across the street. That makes way more sense than finding 4 ghosts in a tiny room, right? Next dot. Command the dead. A slayer may command the spirit of the dead to do her bidding, forcing the ghost to perform any actions that the demon desires if her will proves greater than its. System. Role manipulation plus leadership. The slayer may command any single spirit that can hear her voice. The spirit may attempt to counteract the effect with a resisted willpower roll, difficulty 8. If the spirit's roll fails, it must obey the demon's command to the best of its ability. The effects of this evocation last for a number of turns equal to the character's faith score. Torment. Monstrous demons can command spirits just as well, but they warp any beings by the force of their torment, causing ghosts to become maddened, violent entities that lash out at the living at the first opportunity. Once the evocation's effects expire, the storyteller makes a willpower roll, difficulty 8, for an affected spirit. The roll requires a number of successes equal to or greater than the number of turns that the ghost spent under the demon's control. If the roll fails, the spirit becomes malevolent and hostile towards the living for a number of days equal to the demon's torment score. If the roll botches, the change is permanent. Very nice evocation here, at least in theory. I love the idea of being able to command spirits, having unseen servants or guards watching over you when everyone else thinks your protagonist is completely alone. But slayers themselves probably don't have the time to forge a genuine bond with a random wraith they just summoned, so they resort to commanding this ghost into performing certain tasks. Makes perfect sense. The problem here is duration, which limits any command to brief and simple actions. You can't send your wraith to spy on someone, and you can't send them to perform some dastardly task in the other part of the neighborhood, because the duration of this power will run out. It's only a few turns. It almost seems to be the equivalent of the first dot of Dominate from Vampire the Masquerade, except you can only command ghosts and it costs more XP. Plus, if the Fallen is unfamiliar with the spirit they are commanding, how will the Slayer know what the Wraith is capable of? Even if used only in a desperate situation to attack or defend, there is no guarantee the ghost is capable of interacting with the physical world, and in the core book we actually don't find any stats or mechanics for such entities. Instead, we find such stats in the Storyteller's Companion. So, as written, the evocation is a huge gamble, even in situations where the command is brief. The way I'd make this work is to just say the spirit does its best to aid in whatever task the Slayer commands, and only leaves once the task is fulfilled or failed, of course. No number of turns. As with the previous evocation, it lasts for a scene. I definitely think the number of successes rolled should dictate the Wraith's skill or ability to perform that specific command, though it might be an extended task like investigating or doing research for the Slayer, or even, why not, driving a vehicle to a location. So if the character rolls only one success on a defend me command, the Wraith is probably going to be dispatched after materializing briefly and soaking one attack from an enemy. But with 4 or 5 successes, maybe it withstands 4 or 5 attacks, or even 4 or 5 entire rounds of continuous punishment from all these enemies. I'm pretty sure this example isn't the best, but I definitely think a third dot evocation that allows a character to command the dead should offer more options, because there is so much cool stuff you can use ghostly servants for. Next dot. Anchor the soul. This powerful evocation allows a Slayer to anchor a disinterred mortal soul, or a demon's spirit, to a physical object, creating a haunted artifact that traps the spirit in the physical world. In the darker days of the War of Wrath, Slayers used this evocation to bind the souls of mortals and angels to fuel powerful weapons and tools crafted by the Anunnaki. System. Spend 1 faith point and roll stamina plus awareness. The difficulty is determined by the nature of the object being used as an anchor. Binding a soul to something that was close to the person in life, difficulty 6, is the most effective kind of anchor, while foreign objects prove more challenging depending on their composition. Crystals, gems, or precious metals are useful, difficulty 7, while natural objects such as wood, glass, or bone are less so, difficulty 8. Synthetic objects such as plastic or high-tech items such as computers are challenging to use, difficulty 9. Your character must be within a number of yards of the spirit equal to his faith rating in order to affect it, and he must hold the intended anchor. The spirit can resist imprisonment with a resisted willpower roll, difficulty 8. If you get more successes, the spirit is trapped within the anchor and cannot interact with the outside world unless the object has been properly attuned. See Lore of the Forge, page 190. Demons bound to an attuned item can still access their inherent powers, including their lore paths, provided they have faith available. Any existing pacts with mortal thralls remain in effect. This evocation persists for a number of days equal to your character's faith score, or it can be made permanent by expending a temporary willpower point. If an anchor is ever destroyed, the spirit is freed immediately. Freed mortal souls disappear forever or become ghosts haunting a locale, at the storyteller's discretion. Freed demons must resist the pull of the abyss and attempt to locate another host body or physical anchor. Torment. Monstrous demons bind spirits with a shroud of suffocating darkness, imposing the slightest taste of agony suffered in the abyss. These trapped souls are so frenzied by their hardship that their despair leaks into the physical realm, surrounding their anchors with an aura of ill fortune. Individuals touching or carrying such a spirit anchor botch their actions on a roll of 1 or 2. The first thing I want to say is that this evocation is very similar to an evocation of the Lore of the Forge, as pointed out by one of our listeners, Jack Mallon, and I think here we can see a sort of syncretism between the powers of the malefactors and those of the slayers, because, according to multiple sources regarding the Alabaster Legion, these two houses worked side by side in the creation of the Haven, predominantly known as the Low Umbra. So it makes a lot of sense. They made use of each other's tools and learned each other's craft. The book Houses of the Fallen tells, and I quote, "In the Alabaster Legion, the Anunnaki inventors worked hand in hand with the Slayers to develop relics that could protect human souls from oblivion or hollow out the substance of the spirit realms to create a hiding space. The process was very slow and difficult, for the Anunnaki had only the vaguest knowledge of the spirit and the worlds beyond the material, while their Slayer allies struggled to communicate with the prosaic and pragmatic malefactors. One of these Anunnaki, Shatankoji, a former pupil of Nimer, gained a rapid understanding of the spirit, and his devices became an integral part of the Alabaster Legion's Haven project. So you see, this similarity between two evocations of different lores ultimately makes sense. The second thing I want to mention is that I had initially misread the rules. I thought no spirit can interact with the outside world after being anchored, but it seems demons can still freely access their supernatural abilities, including lores, provided they have enough faith. So no, you cannot use this power to render disembodied fallen completely harmless. As such, this ability is more similar to the Malefactor's own than I originally thought. It is still useful for pulling an Earthbound out of their potentially indestructible reliquary once they assume their apocalyptic form, putting them into a vessel that can be transported and stashed away. This is no small feat, since the Earthbound is no longer in their reliquary during their rites of worship, so they cannot regain faith. In time, they will starve and fall into torpor, unless they make a deal with their captor. So trapping a fallen into a mini reliquary of your choice is a very powerful thing, even if they can still use supernatural abilities. Other than that, you can bind powerful wraiths into objects, and in their case, they cannot interact with the outside world unless the item is attuned. How does attunement work? To attune an object, you temporarily spend a permanent point of willpower, marking it off your sheet for as long as the item is attuned. Once you unattune, you regain that willpower point. It is the price to pay for establishing a permanent connection with an enchanted relic. So, though it can't be used to create a genuine, inescapable prison, this evocation is still solid, and it affords the character a lot of bargaining power, especially if other fallen intentionally want to change their reliquary of residence. Cursed or haunted items such as books, chests, puzzle boxes, gems, jewelry, all of these are a staple of the horror genre, so being able to create such artifacts is really awesome. And of course, work it out with the storyteller to see exactly what interesting powers attuned relics of this type afford the protagonists. Final dot. Restore the dead. This evocation allows a slayer to anchor a spirit into any soulless physical body. This effort returns the ghost to the lands of the living, at least for a short time. System. Spend 1 faith point and roll stamina plus awareness. The slayer must have the soul she wishes to restore in her immediate vicinity and be able to touch the body she wants it to possess. The body in question must have died only recently, within the last 48 hours. If successful, the soul is anchored to the body, healing any injury the body may have had and returning the spirit to the land of the living. The new person has the same physical attributes that the body had in its former life, and the mental and social attributes and abilities of the new soul. The effects of this evocation last for a number of days, equal to your character's faith score, or it can be made permanent by expending 1 point of permanent willpower. Demon spirits without hosts can be placed into bodies through this evocation. Torment. Monstrous demons who perform this evocation invariably taint the spirit with their own torment, leaving the soul twisted by hate and pain. Once the soul has been restored, the storyteller makes a willpower roll for it with a difficulty equal to your character's torment. If the roll is successful, the restored person suffers a temporary derangement. If the roll fails, the derangement is permanent. If the roll botches, the restored person becomes a frenzied monster, attacking the living until it is destroyed. If a disembodied demon spirit is put into a body with the high torment version of this evocation, a willpower roll is made for it too. If the roll is successful, the possessing demon has a torment score that's 1 point less than your character's. If the willpower roll fails, the possessing demon's torment score equals to your character's. And if the willpower roll botches, the possessing demon's torment score exceeds your character's by 1 point. Very nice. For the most part, the writing is clear, the evocation works, but the high torment version can lead to gross misunderstandings. The text reads, if a disembodied demon spirit is put into a body with the high torment version of this evocation, a willpower roll is made for it too. If the roll is successful, the possessing demon has a torment score that's 1 less point than your character's. Okay, so am I to understand that when a Torment 4 Slayer uses this ability on a disembodied Earthbound, let's say, the Earthbound's torment, which is 10, changes to 3? No, of course not, because had that been the case, this power could have healed irredeemable monsters and made them see reason and compassion, which they can't and never will. I think what the power wants to say is that if the disembodied demon's torment is lower than the Slayer's own, it rises to either 1 under, equal, or 1 higher than the Slayer's rating, and uses of this power can never be used to diminish someone's torment. I think phrasing it this way would have made a lot more sense. But hey, the character can now bring the dead back to life for the cost of 1 permanent willpower point. Amazing! I think bringing someone back from the dead is a very serious decision to make, and having to gamble a permanent stat point on this adds gravity and weight to this power. Imagine the Slayer resorting to this evocation to save a dying parent so that the child will not be left all alone in the world. The power succeeds, the spirit is returned to the body, everything seems to be fine, so the Slayer minds their own business for a week or 2, and when they decide to revisit this person whose life they've saved, they realize they've created a monster. What was once a kind, fun, and loving person is now, let's say, a sadistic researcher obsessed with death and the journey into the afterlife, so much so that they took to experimenting with any helpless beings that were around, their pets, and lastly, their own child. An absolutely horrifying situation, which makes for a very tragic way to maybe introduce a high torment Slayer antagonist who wanted to do good and give someone a second chance, but instead they brought a deranged killer back into the world. Such is the agony of high torment fallen. Even when their conscience flares up and they try to do the right thing, their torment might just bleed through uncontrollably and ruin everything. And on that demoralizing note, let's have a look at the apocalyptic form next. Nergal, the visage of the spirit. The angels of the spirit world appear as pale, serene figures reminiscent of the images of human saints. beautiful, silent, and remote. Like others of their house, the Nergal move without noise or effort, seeming to glide along the ground as they move. Only their eyes, colored in shifting patterns of gray and black, hint at the bleak world beyond the mortal realm. The Visage of the Spirit confers the following special capabilities. Ghost sight. The angel can see the spirits of the dead that linger in the mortal realm, whether the ghosts wish to reveal themselves or not, with a successful perception roll, difficulty 6. Enhanced social traits. The angel's beatific appearance provides the following bonus traits: +2 charisma, +1 manipulation, +1 appearance. Pass without trace. The difficulties of the character's stealth rolls decrease by 2, and her passage does not disturb the surrounding environment in any way. She leaves no footprints and disturbs no foliage. Wings. A pair of raven's wings extends from the character's shoulders. At full extension, each wing is a third again as long as the character is tall. The character can glide up to 3 times her running speed per turn. Torment. Monstrous Nergal are stained with the blood of the dead, their alabaster skin streaked with lines of crimson and black. Their eyes are orbs of clotted blood, and when they speak, their voices howl like the spirits of the damned. The Visage of the Spirit confers the following high torment special capabilities. Cloak of Shadows. The demon is shrouded in a pall of darkness, making her features difficult to see in the best of light and rendering her near invisible at night. The difficulties of all stealth rolls decrease by 2 whenever the demon stands in a pool of shadow or moves in darkness. If the character is attacked, the rules for blind fighting apply to the attacker. Howl of the Damned. The difficulties of all intimidation rolls decrease by 2. Aura of Dread. The demon is surrounded by an aura of fear that saps the will of her foes. Targets within a number of yards equal to the character's faith lose their normal initiative unless a successful willpower roll is made against a difficulty equal to the demon's torment. Affected individuals act last within a given turn. The willpower roll is made every turn in which a person or another demon is in the Nergal's apocalyptic presence. Normal initiative resumes for a victim as soon as a successful willpower roll is made. Damage resistance. The demon is capable of shrugging off damage that would cripple a normal human. She may ignore any wound penalties for the duration of the scene, although penalties return and apply normally when human form is resumed. Aha! This is one of those forms that make so much sense and ties in with the lore so well. I just love it. Enhanced social traits make sense because slayers bearing this visage had to persuade their beloved mortals to trust them and take refuge in their haven without being forced to do so, at least at first, before they learned to simply command these spirits. So the enhanced social traits can be attributed to that interaction and closeness. Pass without trace, great, and again, it makes sense for those who worked on the Haven project and needed to be unseen most of the time. For the cost of gaining 1 temporary torment point, Cloak of Shadows enhances this effect, and, used in conjunction with Pass without trace, it will reduce the difficulty of the stealth roll by 4, making the standard difficulty 2, which is completely insane, alright? However, these guys don't get cast no reflection, so be aware of video surveillance. Wings make sense for anyone who needs to navigate the underworld, flying through the Tempest using the lore of the realms, and finally, my favorite visage power, Ghost Sight. This is what makes all the difference between Nergal Slayers and the other 2 visages. These guys can actually see the wraiths they are communicating with by just assuming this form power, which makes much more sense than having a separate evocation for seeing the dead, one for talking, one for summoning, one for commanding, and so on. No, as long as they choose to, these slayers can see the dead without much effort, even from the physical world. Their very form and nature is attuned to perceiving these souls, since that is what they were hiding and guarding against the loyalist host, human souls. The other two visages can interact with the dead, but they cannot perceive them. This is, I think, a fantastic way to really emphasize the duty of each visage. So much flavor here. And seeing the dead might reveal a lot of information that is lost to the other Slayer visages. You can see the shape of the corpus. You might be able to see the death marks or the guild marks, but even in absence of these elements taken from Wraith the Oblivion, you can see the stance, the posture of the ghost, their expression, and you can probably tell a lot quicker if the spirit means you harm, if they might be a specter, an agent of oblivion. The high torment powers are also really good, and though they very much seem like fear effects, I'm tempted to say both Howl of the Dead and Aura of Dread work against demons as well. I mean, Howl of the Dead lowers the difficulty of intimidation rolls by 2, and intimidation rolls themselves are not a supernatural fear effect, but a mundane way of frightening and discouraging an opponent. Similarly, Aura of Dread doesn't force a flight response from nearby assailants, but instead it saps their willpower, their confidence, and the swiftness with which they can act. So I think both abilities can affect the Fallen as well, but feel free to disagree with me. This is just my own interpretation of the rules. Last but not least, damage resistance is always good. Always. Just imagine a Slayer whose legs were crushed for any reason, accident, or maybe they were chopped off with a powerful weapon, or even a lupine's claws. By assuming its apocalyptic form, this Fallen makes itself whole again, because no matter how crippled the host body is, the true form of this entity remains perfectly functional, and it seems indestructible. It's like a Terminator or the killers from slasher horrors, right? Shoot it, stab it, bash it, burn it. Nope, you can't stop it. It keeps coming after you. And there we have it, the lore of the spirit, which, despite the confusing mechanics and rules, is really, really good. It makes so much sense lore-wise if we consider the history and the duty of these slayers who bear the visage of Nergal. There is a lot of narrative cohesion here, something that was missing from the lore of death, but sadly the lore of spirit is much less sound mechanically and will require more than a few fixes for the rules to really make sense in the context of a game. I do believe this is one of the most challenging lores for the storyteller, so I am very much tempted to do a follow-up episode presenting and addressing these challenges. Otherwise, we're going in reverse order now, checking out another set of house lores. The next one will be the Devourer's Lore of the Wild. Thank you very much for listening, take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.